It's a calculation that's actually perhaps not unlike what some of the Jews do today. You know, if you join the global left and any of the left-wing movements, you assume a package of causes, and the Palestinian cause is the central cause there. And it's the same in the academia, where there are social repercussions, right? If you don't join them, then, you know, you lose friends.
Do you know the case of the Association of German National Jews?
Somewhat.
They thought that they could solve the Jewish problem by marrying into German society, eradicating Jewish identity, expelling all the Eastern European Jewish immigrants in Germany. 1935, the chairman, Max Naumann, is arrested. You will never believe the name of the concentration camp he was sent to. Colombia. Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Levy. Student radicals protesting on campuses around the world, Israel condemned for everything that's wrong with the world, and global Jewry facing attack simply for the crime of breathing while being Jewish. I hope you're having deja vu, because the massive anti-Israel protest movement didn't come out of nowhere, and its accusations against the Jewish state are nothing new. They have deep, deep roots, and for that, we have to go back to Soviet Russia to see how the USSR planted the seeds of the ideological movement that has captured Western campuses and is weaponizing them against Israel and the Jews. Izabella Tabarovsky is a senior program associate at the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center and a contributing writer at Tablet magazine. She's also one of the world's leading experts on Soviet anti-Zionism, contemporary left-wing anti-Semitism, and what connects them, giving us a movement that thinks it's marching inexorably to a brave new world, but in fact draws on the ideas strategically planted by one of the darkest regimes of recent times. Izabella takes us through the history of ideas that has led us to where we find ourselves today. She shows us that none of the ideas being presented by today's cosplaying student radicals in the global Tentifada are new or fresh. Rather, they link back to a lengthy history of anti-Semitic tropes that have served the interests of Israel's staunchest and most powerful enemies throughout time. If you're wondering what queers for Palestine or drag queens for Hamas have been smoking, today's episode is about the real opium of the masses. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Izabella Tabarovsky, welcome to State of a Nation.
Thank you for having me.
A lot of people around the world have been shocked by the anti-Israel, some would say, I would say, anti-Semitic protests taking place on US campuses, shocked by the violence, the self-righteousness, the way that other causes have infiltrated themselves, and you see the zeal of people claiming that Palestine is an LGBT cause, for example. It shocked a lot of people. Let's have a quick look, before we begin our discussion, for those who haven't been following what's been happening on American campuses, at some of the collective psychosis that has taken over these places.
There is only one solution! Antifada revolution! Antifada revolution!
You're hate killers. You should be ashamed. You're Hitler's children. You're anti-Semitic nut jobs. You guys are a bunch of anti-Semites.
There we see students at Columbia University taking over Hamilton Hall. We hear cries of Intifada. It's shocked a lot of people who don't understand where this came from, but for those who've been following very closely, this didn't come out of thin air. This has been a long time coming.
It has been a long time coming, and I've been writing for a long time now, for a number of years, about the danger of the kind of anti-Zionist, quote-unquote, rhetoric that has been permeating American discourse, particularly on the left. And I know about it because I grew up in the USSR, and I first noticed it in America a few years ago. I didn't see it before. We came to America 30 years ago. And I began researching it and studying it and really trying to understand where it came from. And I understood that there had been a massive propaganda campaign geared at Israel and Zionism in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And it's something that we experienced as Soviet Jews. And it was absolutely 100% clear to me that this rhetoric is very dangerous because Zionism here, or Zionists, eventually, it may begin as a political term, as a distinction. These people believe that Zionism is this and that. But eventually it begins to mark all the Jews, and it turns into a label with which you can target all the Jews. And this is precisely what we're seeing today. And
in fact, we've never seen throughout history a society that has embraced anti-Zionism, opposition to Israel, let's put it that way, as its defining ideal, that didn't end up turning against the Jews and end up with no Jews in them. What I really want to understand is where this psychosis is coming from. How did we get to a point where American campuses are full of people chanting for Intifada, convinced that Israel is literally the devil incarnate? What has been happening over the last generation on American campuses? What is the ideological shift, the movement, the narrative that has taken ground that explains how we got to this dangerous moment?
Well, I think there isn't a single simple answer to this question. I think that we're seeing different ideologies fusing together. Specifically now, looking broadly, you can see that there is an Islamist ideology merging or fusing with far-left ideology. We see that, and this gets much less attention on mainstream media, but you see it on social media, that in addition to symbols of various Palestinian terrorist organizations, we see communist symbology, right? We see various Marxist brochures. We see hammer and sickles. And a lot of this rhetoric is very, very kind of Marxist, leftist based. Now, the left is very complex and it's diverse. And I think a number of things have happened, and people talk about postmodernism and critical theory and intersectionality and DEI and Fanon, and there's a whole bunch of different leftist intellectuals. What I look at is how did all of these movements end up infusing the specific rhetoric that we're hearing today? Because none of them actually specifically talk about on their own, right? Fanon will not tell you that Zionism is racism and fascism and Nazism and settler colonialism and apartheid and all of these things. But you do see it in Soviet rhetoric, the specific weaponization of this kind of demonization of Israel and the pushing out of these ideas to the global left. We have to thank the Soviet Union for that. And what's interesting is that as much as the left has evolved since the 60s and 70s and 80s, and certainly since the USSR fell apart, as many movements as there are on the left, as many different intellectuals and ideas there are on the left, this one thing they all share. Trotskyites hated the Soviet Union, but they still thought the same way about Zionists as the tankies, the pro-Soviet left. So that is a really fascinating thing to me.
And I suppose that's where you find what makes anti-Semitism unique, and not being a mere prejudice, that it acts as an organizing principle for so many disparate movements that cannot agree on anything other than the fact that they hate the Jews. You said that actually you're having the sense of deja vu because it's all very familiar to you from the Soviet Union. So I want to try to connect the dots and understand, what are you seeing within modern far-left, so-called progressive discourse that sets off alarm bells saying, we've seen this in the Soviet Union before? What are the patterns you're spotting?
Well, the demonization itself, kind of broadly speaking, what does it mean? When you look at the classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the key theme there is the Jews stand at the heart of everything, of all of world's affairs, right? Jews manipulate everything behind the scenes. And in fact, even when you see democracy, you need to look below so that you can understand that, in fact, if you look carefully, you will see that Jews are manipulating it. And democracy is, in fact, a cover for a devious Jewish plot to control the world. And so you will see Jews manipulating the media and the banks and politicians. Jews are everywhere, right?
Is that what we're seeing now in the far-left protests?
Well, what we're seeing on the far-left protests is basically this thing said about Zionists, right? But we know that Zionists have become a code word for Jews. So many people on the left may think that they're only speaking about Zionists. But as you said, anti-Semitism is an organizing principle for a lot of disparate movements. And so then this language will also sound just fine and as a dog whistle to the far right, who are also the far right, meaning like the Nazis, white supremacists.
Right. There are slogans that are very difficult to tell whether they're coming from the left or the right. Zionist occupied government. I can't remember anymore whether that's a left-wing term or a right-wing term.
Exactly. Well, and what you see, what's interesting, I've been pointing it out in my writings, is that you see people like David Duke, right, Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist, praising people like Ilhan Omar, praising people like Jeremy Corbyn for their opposition to Zionism. I've been writing about
extremists of the world unite.
That's exactly it. It's like you would think that you should wonder about your ideas if an actual white supremacist is praising them. But this is it. The far right never really made the distinction. They mostly spoke about, far right, I mean neo-Nazis and white supremacists, right? They speak about Jews, but they also speak about Zionists. There were protocols of the elders of Zion that also spoke Zion, right? They're protocols of the elders of Zion. So they also were freaked out by the kind of emerging Zionist movement. So it becomes a language that bridges this otherwise unbridgeable ideological divides.
Parallels we're seeing now are striking between what's happening in far-left progressive discourse, the Soviet Union, the demonization of Israel, the use of Zionist as a code word for Jews. But it also goes more specifically to very specific allegations. Genocide, for example, the latest blood libel that has been invented that I think has shocked people, that the Overton window has shifted in many parts of progressive discourse. It's now acceptable to accuse the Jewish state of genocide. But that's not new either.
Precisely.
Is it?
Precisely. In fact, right now, I'm sort of doing this research project where I'm looking at the left-wing press from 67 onward. And 67 is significant here because it's Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. This sets off massive alarm bells for the USSR, and that's when it begins to coordinate a response. And so already in...
Sorry, just to unpack that a second, what is the purpose of this Soviet propaganda against Israel? Why does the Soviet Union decide to pick on Israel, repackaging these old anti-Semitic ideas?
Well, so it's really driven by foreign policy interests. The Soviets, this is the Cold War. The Soviets are fighting. They're in this kind of war with the U.S. When Israel wins against Soviet allies, right? Who are not just Soviet allies, Arab allies. The Soviet Union supplied them with weapons. The Soviet Union trained them.
Humiliating for a superpower.
Absolutely humiliating. And they are shocked that it actually happened. They never believed it would happen. And so they begin to think, well, how could such a small country as Israel win over all these armies that we supplied and trained? And so they begin to connect the dots. And you have to understand that Soviet political culture was always conspiracist. That's what happens when you have a totalitarian culture. And this is only 15 years after Stalin died. So they begin to connect the dots, meaning America must have helped them. And, there is an ideology, the Soviets are obsessed with ideology. And so they think that there is an ideology, must be an ideological influence that's really dangerous. And so they look at Zionism. And in any case, the Soviets always viewed Jews with suspicion, right? Jewish identity in particular, the KGB viewed it through the security lens. They viewed Jews as a potentially dangerous, as a subversive agent. And so this is when it begins, and they realize that they need to craft kind of a response rhetorically, and they also need to they now believe that Zionists are everywhere. They run the world. They look at America and they say, well, look, wow, American Jews, they're everywhere. There are Jews everywhere. Why there are so many Jews in Congress? Why there are so many Jews here and there? And look, they're all pro-Israel. And so they really believe that America is run by Jews. Then they say it's run by Zionists. And so they believe that it requires a massive, massive, massive response. And so there is a propaganda campaign, and there is an influence campaign, and there is a kind of covert action campaign. It's a multiple kind of, they begin to build out a leftist ecosystem consisting of the global left and also the developing world to create an influence against it.
And as part of this Soviet campaign of propaganda that targets Zionists, read Jews, all this conspiratorial thinking, they invent several of the legends and myths that are coming back with a vengeance now. And one of them is that Israel is guilty of genocide, and this is long before the war in Gaza. Take me to the origins of that blood libel in Soviet thinking.
So you see that already appear, certainly in 1969, probably even before, but this is when there is a conference that takes place in Cairo, and you hear a Soviet speaker announce this, essentially, and then it's published in an article of all of the sins of Israel and Zionism, and genocide is one of them. And so from then on, you see it in Soviet literature all the time. That Israel is conducting a genocide in Gaza, and so
in Gaza specifically?
In general, against the Palestinian people,
okay.
Against the Palestinian people overall. So that becomes normalized as part of the left-wing discourse. It becomes kind of it's taken for granted.
How did these Soviet ideas manage to migrate from the feverish minds of communist bureaucrats and politburos in Moscow to American campuses in 2024?
Well, look, that is a really important question that we still need to understand. My theory, and it's kind of, I see it kind of proving itself as I look at the left-wing writings from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, is that it became part of the left-wing discourse at the time. So, and not just communist, because at that time the Soviets are pretty omnivorous. They're willing to talk to anyone on the left who will be willing to kind of play back and echo these ideas that they're putting out. And so all these left-wing socialists, it becomes part of that discourse. And the reason I think that this is, and so it remains there, right? And I think that it
as part of global left-wing discourse having been fed through the Soviet Union.
Exactly. And I think what's new now is that we're just hearing it now because everything is polarized and the radical ideas are coming into the center. So it's appearing now to us as if it's new, but it was always there. And I know it from a friend who was part, for example, of a Trotskyite group in the UK in the 80s. She was telling me that this discourse was there already. We know it from, I've traced some of the backgrounds of the Corbynites, the things that they were writing and saying in the 80s. It's all part of their thinking back then. And these people are still now today. Corbyn is leading this protest against Israel. And we know, of course, we remember the scandal that his party created around the crisis of anti-Semitism. The same rhetoric was there. And I think that in some ways I can imagine that they truly believed that they weren't being anti-Semitic. They were just saying the things that they learned as young people, as in this left-wing ecosystem. They really, truly believed it. And so they're bringing it into today's conversation.
If this has been here all along, the Soviet narrative about Israel being an agent of imperialism that is guilty of settler colonialism and Zionism, we'll take Zionism, guilty as charged, and genocide and all other sorts of nasty things. How is it possible that the American Jewish establishment, that gave itself the mission of keeping American Jewry safe and fighting anti-Semitism, missed this? How did this go under everyone's noses, under the radar, until it reached these truly monstrous proportions that we're only waking up to it now?
I mean, that's really a crucial question. I think, again, because for a while it was on the radical fringes, and so perhaps the mainstream Jewish community was not even necessarily aware of it. And then, of course, we know that the American Jewish community tends toward the left, although here I want to make a distinction between liberal left and far left.
And there is absolutely nothing liberal about the people who are chanting for Intifada on American campuses.
Precisely. That's exactly it. But for a while, certainly in the most recent history, we've seen the American left and Jewish left adopt ideas that were illiberal, but which it thought that somehow it needed to adopt because, this is what good people do. My writings, I started writing about this in 2018. People read them, people thought it was interesting, but I don't think people thought it was dangerous. This whole debate we were having back in those years until October 7th, which anti-Semitism is worse, left or right? And people would say, well, the far right is armed. They're far more dangerous. And it was this, Sharansky often talks about it. It's like people on the opposite side, pointing at each other on the opposite side and saying, your anti-Semitism is worse. And people like me were saying, well, all anti-Semitism is bad, and this anti-Semitism is dangerous in its own ways. And of course, we see it now.
And let's try to delve into what is specifically anti-Semitic about it, because I understand the argument that people make. They look at these protests, ostensibly against Israel, and say this is a protest against Israeli government policy, against the state of Israel itself. They'll own that. They say they don't think the state of Israel should exist and we should dissolve ourselves, preferably in a bathtub of acid. But what makes this specifically anti-Semitic is the way that it brings together so many disparate causes. They say Palestine is a climate justice cause, as if, Hamas, which burnt its way through the kibbutzim, was particularly friendly for carbon emissions. They say that Palestine is a transgender cause, and you see these drag queens for Palestine. And they say that Palestine is a gay rights cause, even though Hamas and Palestinian Authority, virulently homophobic regimes, they'll even say that Palestine is a reproductive justice cause. Okay,
Right.
And what they do is they take all of these issues and essentially say all of the problems in the world are interlinked.
Yes.
And what links them? The Jews.
Exactly.
Solve the problem of the Jews and you redeem the world. And I want to show a clip here that popped up on my Twitter feed from the University of Leeds in England. Someone, again, making this point that it's Israel, it's Zionism, that actually links a million things that I had no idea we were involved in. Let's take a listen.
Of America, in Atlanta, where the idea of training American police in Cop City who only exist to enforce white supremacy and the suppression and murder, the brutal murder of black and Native American voices. I can keep going. Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, any country, Kashmir, Egypt, wherever you see imperialism and capitalist oppression of the global south, Cuba, Philippines, I can keep going. Wherever you see the imperialist aggression, what else do you see? Zionism's bloody hands.
Here you have this lovely gentleman basically farting through his mouth every problem he can think of in the world and saying, wherever you see imperialism and colonialism and the oppression of the global south, what do you see? Zionism's bloody hands,
Right.
the Jews. Now, you've written before about how anti-Semitism has always been a political tool. It's been an organizing principle that has allowed all these different movements that don't agree on anything except for the fact they hate the Jews to work together. A political tool, but I'm wondering, today, 2024, a political tool in the service of what?
Well, that I think is a really big question. I think one thing that's becoming more and more clear from the demonstrations is, again, we have two movements, essentially, broad movements that are coalescing, right? So there is the so-called pro-Palestine movement, which wants to erase Israel off the face of the earth. And of course, I think that pro-Palestine is a terrible misnomer. I don't think that it serves anybody. It doesn't serve real people in the Palestinian territories. And then you have this long-term holy grail for the left, which is to destroy imperialism and capitalism.
And all structures of oppression.
Precisely, and to bring down America because, well, today's left talks about it as being undeserving of existence because it's white supremacist.
It's fascinating you mentioned that because, in some ways these protests will attack Israel and they're anti-Semitic in the sense that they take the original sins of their own society, colonialism, and cast that onto Israel and tell the story of ancient people returning to their ancestral homeland as a story of white settler colonialism. But you see them turning against America as well, with a chance of death to America, since they want to undo America's own institutions.
Yes. Well, and it was always this way. Again, when you look at Soviet propaganda, they view everything through the lens of, of who is their main enemy? It's America, right? And so sort of this anti-Zionist cause becomes a battering ram to bring down American imperialism, to bring down their enemy. They have a very selfish goal. They want to win in this Cold War. And so to me, it's not surprising that the two go together. It's not anything new. And we hear people talk about in today's demonstrations, that, well, we are here in the lair of the beast, I think they're saying, something like that. We are right here where the American imperialism is, and we need to undermine it from within. Again, old rhetoric, but they're bringing it together. And for them, the Palestinian cause becomes a means toward that, because no other causes have helped them achieve it. The working class has refused to fight for the revolution, to their big disappointment. So now they're hoping that maybe the Palestinian cause can do that.
And what is it? I wonder what it is about the Palestinian cause, as distinct from all other causes around the world, that happens to create that organizing principle to allow these people to work together.
I mean, it's just been, I think that it's manufactured that way. It's been manufactured over years and decades to the point where it becomes, it's like, if you join the global left and any of the left-wing movements on the far left, it's like you assume a package of causes, and the Palestinian cause is the central cause there. I just think it's historically that way, and they continue with it.
One of the Soviet ideas that I found particularly disturbing, as part of the package of Israel being a settler, colonial, white imperialist state that's guilty of genocide, etc., Holocaust inversion. And we're recording this shortly before Yom HaShoah, Remembrance Day for the Holocaust in Israel. And I've been particularly disturbed over the course of the war with Hamas. The realization that actually the big challenge facing us with Holocaust education as the last survivors die, it's not people denying that the Holocaust happened. They'll say it happened. but they'll say what Israel is doing is worse. And from there, it's only a short leap away to saying, one, therefore it's open season on Zionists, just like it's open season on Nazis. Two, that maybe you had it coming after all. And I've got two examples here that show really these are not fringe ideas anymore, Holocaust inversion. The first we have here is a tweet from Francesca Albanese, the truly repulsive UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, who's been one of the most virulent propagandists against Israel, I would say an unrepentant anti-Semite. As we see from this tweet from the beginning of December, she writes, "Fellow Europeans, Italians, Germans, after the Holocaust, we should instinctively know that genocide starts with dehumanizing the other. If Israel's current attack against Palestinians doesn't prompt our strong reaction, the darkest page of our recent history has taught us nothing," saying this barely 2 months after Hamas invaded on October 7th, burned whole families alive. Her response is not that the descendants of Holocaust survivors have a right to fight back against people who want to burn their families to ash. It's that Israel's defensive mechanism reminds her of the dehumanization of the Nazis. And now we have from the London Review of Books as well a really repulsive front page. "Memories of Jewish suffering at the hands of the Nazis are the foundation on which most descriptions of extreme ideology and atrocity have been built. But these universalist reference points are in danger of disappearing as the Israeli military massacres and starves Palestinians while denouncing as anti-Semitic or champions of Hamas all those who plead with it to desist," essentially telling Israel and Jews around the world here that they're essentially the new Nazis. The Holocaust had nothing to do with them. These are universalist reference points, and they should get their own house in order instead of worrying about genuine anti-Semitism. Deeply disturbing Holocaust inversion, and I'm wondering, how far back does this go? What are the origins of this thing?
Well, this too goes really far back. There was an article in the New Yorker also that came out in the fall where Masha Gessen told, the kind of high-minded intellectual audiences of New York, of the New Yorker, that she compared Gaza to a ghetto and said that, and she seemed to think that she was the one who first came up with this. We see it in Soviet literature already, again in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I'm afraid that I'm starting to sound like a broken record when I keep saying, well, the Soviets said it before, they said it already decades ago, but it's really true. But this kind of an inversion, there's been kind of this long-term attempt since the Holocaust to really show that Jews are not this perfect victim, that Jews also were bad, that they also participated in terrible things. So this actually, again, happens across the political spectrum. So in this is a very, it's the kind of language that helps, that connects the anti-Semitic far right with the anti-Semitic far left.
And specifically on the anti-Semitic far left, what is the story that the Soviet conspiratorial propaganda machine is telling about the Holocaust, and how are they inverting it?
So they're telling specifically, they're talking about Israelis perpetrating a genocide against Palestinians in these territories. They talk about Zionists collaborating with the Nazis in the Holocaust. So they're really trying to equate Zionists with the Nazis already, again, in the 60s. And I think, especially for Soviet people, this was a very kind of, remember, this propaganda also goes internally. For the Soviet people, the memory of World War II is so resonant, but also for the Europeans, anytime you say the Nazi, you think, well, that's just the lowest creature. I think if you're part of a secular movement, like a communist movement, Nazi is the equivalent of the devil. And so they're essentially, and we saw this kid in Colombia who says that
yes, the leader of the protest movement, Haimani James,
exactly,
saying that as far as he's concerned, what Zionists have no right to live, just like Nazis have no right.
Exactly, Zionists don't deserve to live. And what's interesting is that Albanese talks about dehumanization. One of the things that's been really striking for me, and we saw it in the clip at the opening of the show, is when these Jewish kids who have tried to engage with the protesters or have tried to walk through the encampments, how are the protesters treating them? Not only are they not engaging with them, they either stare through them as if they're an empty space, or they completely avert their gaze, and it's like for them, these Jewish kids who they've decided are Zionists and therefore equivalent to Nazis, don't even deserve to be engaged when they are not human. And that is a fundamentally anti-Semitic perception.
One of the things I found very disturbing with these recent protests, and for you will spark deja vu from your studies of the history of anti-Semitism, it's the elephant in the room, we have to discuss it, the participation of so many Jews in these protests. I can't think of a greater Chilul Hashem than to wear a keffiyeh as a talid, but you see them holding their seders in the middle of these so-called liberated zones on campus, as if they forgot that actually the original Exodus was about the Jewish people going to the land of Israel, but let's put that to one side. A lot of them have been participating. They're a small minority, a very small minority, but in numbers, they do provide numbers on campuses, taking part in these protests against Israel, throwing their lot in with the cause for liberation of Palestine, as they would call it, taking the side of Hamas. And I'm wondering, where else have we seen this pattern before in the 20th century of Jews taking the side and finding themselves as pawns in a bigger anti-Semitic movement? What happened to them?
Well, of course, the classic story is of the Jews who participated in the Bolshevik Revolution. There was quite a good number of them. It was understandable, perhaps, because Jews were the most oppressed minority in the Russian Empire. A lot of Jews joined the revolution. And you know, what's interesting about that is that from the beginning, the Bolsheviks were saying, we are against anti-Semitism. It was, in fact, an important kind of part of their platform. But there was a condition. They were against anti-Semitism, but they were also against Zionism already back then. And they were, of course, against religion. So you could be accepted in that movement as a Jew, but conditionally, right? And the condition is that you not be Zionist and you not be religious. And so a lot of Jews did well in that. But then if you were a Zionist, if you refused to give up a belief in a Jewish national homeland in these territories, then you were persecuted. And the same thing happened if you refused to give up your faith. And so when people...
by the way, this is where I think the history of Nazi anti-Semitism has slightly addled our historical perceptions about what anti-Semitism is, because the Nazi form of anti-Semitism specifically gave Jews no escape. There was absolutely nothing to do, nowhere they could escape. That's what makes the Nazi regime so much more evil than other movements that have oppressed the
100%.
Jews. There was nowhere to escape, nothing Jews could do to
100%.
buy favor. But actually, historically, within anti-Semitic movements, as we saw the Soviet Union, for example, there was a way to try to save your skin, and that was to try to turn against what represented Judaism for the large majority of the Jewish world.
Exactly, except that it didn't really work. And it didn't work when you look at these Jewish communists, these Jewish Bolsheviks, they are eventually, or like all the Jews, you know, they create a section called Yevsekция, which essentially ends up dealing with all the Jews that somehow deviate from the communist doctrine. And they end up destroying all these other Jewish Bolsheviks who didn't quite fit into the movement. Why? Because the USSR, the Bolsheviks already understood then that Jews are troublesome and you can run into this issue of anti-Semitism, and it's better if Jews do it to themselves with their own hands. The USSR is doing the same. It understands that the best way to deal with Jews is by co-opting Jews into your cause. And so they begin to use Jewish celebrities, there were a few Jewish celebrities in the USSR, and they start getting them to speak at press conferences and condemn Zionism and condemn Israel. And in the 80s, they set up the so-called anti-Zionist Committee of the Soviet Public.
And other Jews who are doing this as a form of survival mechanism, because they know that, you know, if there's a big monster that's bullying you, you want to be on its side and find safety in the hands of the mob? Or are they true believers?
You know, I think it's neither. It's somewhere in between, because the 70s and 80s are already far more sort of vegetarian times. You know, you're not really it's not Stalin's times. You're not going to be sent to a gulag if you say no to speaking at this press conference, right? But what you might experience is problems with practicing your profession. And these are celebrities. They have a lot of perks. So there is a well-known ballerina who's a part of it, you know, and she's written in her memoirs how much she wanted to travel abroad on tours of the Bolshoi, and they wouldn't let her. So, you know, if you are really dedicated to your profession and you want to be able to practice it, you know that you're completely dependent on this regime. So you have to kind of do what it wants you to do. So in a way, I would say it's a calculation that's actually perhaps not unlike what some of the Jews do today, because the losses today, there isn't a KGB, but there are possible social repercussions, right? If you don't join, or if you have friends who are part of this movement and you don't join them, then, you lose friends.
I know certainly Jews in entertainment and liberal circles accept that sticking their necks out for Israel means career suicide, possibly, definitely social suicide. People get uninvited from parties. I mean, when I meet these people, I say, I really couldn't care less if you're getting uninvited from parties because there is so much more that is at stake. But they're paying a cost. They're paying a cost for standing up for Israel and the Jewish people.
And it's the same in the academia, where if it's just a way you're supposed to believe. If you're a good person, David Hirsch, a British academic, talks about the community of the good. The community of the good believes that Zionists are evil. And if you want to be a good person, you want to think of yourself as a good person who wants the best for humanity, then you join in condemning this cause.
I came across a rather disturbing piece of trivia while researching this question of Jews who historically have tried to take the side of anti-Semitic movements as a way of saving their own skin. Do you know the case of the Association of German National Jews?
Somewhat.
Organization founded back in the Weimar era that backed certain Nazi ideas, came out against the global boycotts of Nazi goods. They thought that they could solve the Jewish problem by assimilating entirely into German society. No more marriage within Jewish communities. They were going to solve Jewish ethnicity by marrying into German society, eradicating Jewish identity, expelling all the Eastern European Jewish immigrants in Germany. Somewhat masochistic movement. When Hitler comes to power, they say that the results cause them personal anguish, but the fatherland is more important, so they welcome the results of the 1933 election. And, like we joked today about the Queers for Palestine being chickens for KFC, there was a joke that did the rounds within German Jewish society at the moment in which they would salute and say, "Down with us," essentially, because they'd chosen to take the other side. And of course, the Nazis completely rejected them. The idea that the Jews would marry into German society and as they would see it, pollute the Aryan race was completely anathema to them. 1935, the chairman of the German Association of National Jews, Max Naumann, is arrested. You will never believe the name of the concentration camp he was sent to. Colombia.
No.
Yep. Yeah.
How perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
How perfect.
Horrific and tragic.
Yes.
And hopefully we don't see history repeating itself. But I think a warning to many people who think that actually taking the side of the movements that have historically always turned against Jews, even if it starts with targeting a specific section of Jews, never goes well. I wonder whether you see this anti-Semitic narrative that began with the Soviet Union spreading to. So it starts with the Soviet Union, it goes to the global left, it makes its way onto American campuses. Where else are we seeing it spread into, especially as it fuses with Islamic fundamentalism? China, for example, communist country. Do we see Soviet propaganda making its way into Chinese narratives about Jews and Israel?
Well, I'm not an expert on China, but you certainly see the Chinese speaking about Zionism and Israel in the same way. And I think that in a way, the USSR has left this this kind of heritage, right? This toxic residue, which is available for anyone now to use. And so anyone can come in and it's certainly, they can see how effective it is. And it's effective. In what sense is it effective? Because, Deborah Lipstadt talks about anti-Semitism as a favorite tool of authoritarian regimes. She compares it to a cooking a cooking spoon with which you stir the pot. They can see, the Soviets knew it and others know it really well, that you can inject this anti-Semitic kind of the virus of anti-Semitism into popular discourse. And then look at what it creates in a society, right? It creates riots practically. So I think it's, in that sense, it's a tool that can be used against democracies. And I think that's why China is now adopting it.
What are we seeing specifically in China?
So we see them using the same discourse against Israel and Zionism that's merged and fused with the language with an anti-Western language. They see it as a tool that can be used against the West and against democracies. Now I just want to say that it's important to understand that states like this can't create the problem. What they do is they see the problem that exists, right? They look at a democratic society and they see, well, there are problems here, or you can apply a little bit of pressure and you will create a disturbance there. They want democratic societies, Western societies that they perceive as enemies, to be kind of engrossed in these problems, so that they don't, for example, pay attention to what, let's say, Russia is doing in Ukraine, right? So there are fewer kind of less bandwidths left to looking at what China is doing in Taiwan. So it becomes very much a tool of political warfare.
Because anti-Semitism has always been not only a way for failed societies to deflect attention from their own failings by finding a scapegoat, but also a political tool to try to distract others and get them not to take responsibility. Exactly. Developments in China are very disturbing. I want to move on. We've talked a lot about problems, about how Soviet ideology and propaganda has infiltrated Western spaces. Let's talk about solutions now. You have a Marxist ideology that divides the world into oppressors, oppressed, places the Jews on the side of the oppressed, fusing together with Islamic fundamentalism, a Fanon-like glorification of violence. And I'm wondering, how do you fight back against this phenomenon? How do you roll it back? Do you see any pushback against this? Do you see any feasibility to try to put this problem back in the box and shove it back to the fringes where it belongs?
Well, I mean, I think our first task is to understand the problem, to even identify it. I think we're having trouble even identifying what the problem is. I think a lot of people, look, part of this whole influence operation was to create the confusion and to say, well, you know, this thing that we still hear today, again, you hear the Soviets say it in the 60s and 70s already, that Zionists always try to shut down the criticism of Israel. They bring up...
Oh, that's not a new one either.
No, I'm telling you, it's extreme. It's like everything that we heard as Jews in the USSR, all these things that pushed us out of the country, right? All the things that made it impossible to live in that country, we're hearing them today. So this idea that, yes, Zionists weaponize accusations of anti-Semitism, it's also really old. But a lot of people don't have the tools to understand what's behind it. They don't understand, you know, there's a lot of conversation about how anti-Zionism, there's a conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I think that there is a conflation of criticism of Israel and sort of this eliminationist rhetoric about Israel. People don't understand the difference, right?
No, because you have people saying, you know, these protests are just criticism of Israel.
Exactly.
But as far as they're concerned, calling for the dissolution of Israel with no regard for what's going to happen to the Jews who are living here is criticism.
Exactly.
Okay. Look, we've identified the problem. People who are watching this podcast understand the problem. They understand the fundamentally anti-Semitic roots, origins, essence of the modern anti-Zionist movement. How does the fight back against this begin?
So I think that the fight begins within the Jewish community. We need to tell the story ourselves, to ourselves. We need to tell the story of how this form of anti-Semitism impacted millions of Jews in the Soviet bloc, right? Because the historical evidence is clear. You said it at the beginning. The historical evidence is clear. Whenever anti-Zionism overtakes a society, this is the end of Jewish life. So we need to start introducing the teaching of these ideas in the Jewish community to begin with, right? This is where we have some control. I think that the rest of the American society also needs to understand this story from a broader perspective. It needs to understand how dangerous these ideas are. I think today Americans never understood. I think the Cold War ended and it was like, yeah, we won. And maybe in the end, communism wasn't so bad. And people just don't know. You know, people dismiss me even when I start talking about Stalin's crimes, something that everybody knows about. They say, oh, well, you know, but they tried to build a better future, you know. So I think it starts with education and with people understanding the context of all of this language.
I mean, I'll tell you what I'm asking. I was on Channel 12 the other week, Ulpan Shishi with Danny Kushmarov on Friday night. Israeli media, of course, shocked by what is happening on campuses, hadn't been paying very close attention. This is coming as something of a surprise to many Israelis. And Danny Kushmarov asked me, is Israel doing enough? Now, my gut answer is to say, Danny, this problem is bigger than Israel. This isn't a problem about anything specific we say, anything specific we do. We are pawns in some much larger fantasy culture war that is taking place with issues that have nothing to do with us, and the Jews have just fit into this imagination. And I'm wondering whether you think there is something that Israel, as the nation state of the Jewish people, can be doing, that Israeli society or Israel's leaders should be doing to fight against this? Or is this simply a fight that American Jews are going to have to fight for themselves? And the question is then, how does Israel support American Jews as opposed to somehow taking charge of that fight itself?
So I completely agree with you that this is bigger than us. I think that we need to be investing resources in not necessarily directly fighting it. I don't think we will ever be able to dismantle all the little binaries that they've created for themselves. You know, it's just been around for too long. What I think Israel can do for American Jews, if American Jews want it, I think that American Jews have to ask for it. Because as you know, certainly before October 7th, Israel's help was not always wanted, right? It was often rejected. But I think Israel is a source. You know, Sharansky and Gil Troy talk about it a lot. It's a source of kind of a really strong Jewish identity, and it's a source of an understanding what it means to be a Jew in this world and to have self-determination and to have power. And so I think we need to develop I'm very much into the idea of Jewish peoplehood. I think that that's an idea that really needs to be developed much more.
I wonder, you're saying, therefore, the Israeli response to what we're seeing on campus is not, we need more hasbara, we need better public diplomacy. It's actually, we need to strengthen solidarity and belonging and identity within the global Jewish people. And then we have the organizational basis, if you will, to launch that fight back, whatever tools we then identify.
That's precisely it. I think Israel has something that I think would really help American Jews, again, if they want it, and that is Hebrew, the Hebrew culture. I think it's one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest scandals that American Jews don't have Hebrew. If you don't have Hebrew, you can't. It's not just that you can't participate in the Israeli national conversation. They think that they get all of it in English, but they don't. So much of this conversation happens in Hebrew. They are at the mercy of people who decide to interpret this culture for them. And these people all have their own agendas. You know, you can never make your own decisions. But then you're also cut off from the musical culture. You're cut off from theater. You're cut off from film, even if the film is subtitled for you. It's just not the same.
We're beginning to see actually a shift within diaspora culture, what Professor Yossi Shea in Tel Aviv University calls the Israelization of Jewish culture, that Jewish food is increasingly Israeli food, Jewish music is increasingly Israeli music, Jewish culture increasingly the films and TV shows that are coming out of Israel. I'm a big fan of the idea that all Jews around the world should learn Hebrew. It should be sort of our secret language between ourselves. But before we wrap up, I want to show you here a number of signs that we've seen from these I think by this point of the conversation we can call anti-Semitic protests around the world. And I'm wondering, just very quickly, tell me what historical figure, ideology, argument this brings to mind. Let's play a game of, you know what, let's call this not deja vu, deja-ju, okay? So here we have a sign from London, from a protest recently, a sign, Queers for Palestine, you can't pink-wash colonialism. How old is this idea that actually the Palestinian cause is a cause for trans rights?
Well, I mean, the trans rights, I don't know, but certainly the idea that everybody needs to stand for Palestine. I mean, look, the Soviets were comparing what's happening, kind of the fight, or what Israelis are doing to Palestinians, to the war in Vietnam, American war in Vietnam. So this kind of notion that everybody needs to be, you know, if you are against the war in Vietnam, you also need to be for Palestinians. You know, if you're queer, you also need to be for Palestinians. So very long roots there.
Let's have a look. The next one here is a sign on American university campus saying students will leave when Israelis leave. Students will go back home when Israelis go back to Europe, US, etc. Their real homes, really telling us that this cause of free Palestine means free Palestine of Jews. How old is this idea that actually the way to solve the conflict in the Middle East is that the Jews should pack up and leave?
Well, now this allows me to say that there's one way in which today's protesters are more radical, actually, than what the Soviets did, because the Soviets never openly said that Jews need to be ethnically cleansed from Israel.
No, they definitely didn't want the Jews going back to the Soviet Union.
That's right, exactly. But what they said was that they wanted to de-Zionize Israel. So they wanted Israel without Zionism. They thought that the whole problem, again, is Zionism and its Zionist rulers. But what's interesting about this is
it's really insane when you think about it. This massive nuclear-armed superpower wondering about this tiny little country.
Isn't that amazing?
In the other corner of the world and getting into these little silly ideological disputes and trying to dismantle the national home the Jews have built in order to escape from people like them.
Well, they exactly. Well, and they truly created the anti-Zionist conspiracy, or the Zionist conspiracy theory. They really believe that Zionists are everywhere.
So this is more radical, you're saying?
This is, well, what they, so remember, the Soviets were friends with the Palestinian terrorist groups, friends, meaning they financed them, right? They supported them. So even though they said they didn't want to eliminate Israel, they financed all of the genocidal groups that wanted to eliminate Israel. But they told them, don't say it out loud. You know, they would say to Arafat, basically, don't say it out loud that you want to eliminate Israel. It doesn't work. It's not good for your image. So all of this chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is the Palestinian terrorist organizations without the Soviet supervision, basically, let's put it that way.
Without the Soviet filter to tell them you've gone too far.
Exactly.
Let's take a look at slide 3 in our game of deja-vu. The 2024 trend no one knew we needed. UN officials taking the side of terrorists and terrorist sympathizers. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of that since the October 7th massacre. Here we have a picture of Farida Shahid, the aptly named Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education, visiting the pro-Palestinian encampment at George Washington in a show of support for the rights of students and faculty to free political expression. Of course, not the students and faculty whose education is being disrupted and destroyed by these petulant cosplaying revolutionaries. To a free political expression, academic freedom as we fight for divestment, the liberation of Palestine, blah, blah, blah. In discussions with students and faculty, Shahid, martyr in Arabic, appalled to hear the extent of political repression and violence against the movement for Palestine on GW campus. What do you make of this? How long have UN officials been openly complicit with people? You see the chalk on the ground there saying, join the revolution.
Right. Well, of course, the UN famously adopted the Zionism is Racism resolution in 1975, very much under the Soviet influence.
Repealed after the Cold War.
Exactly. The Soviets had massive influence over the UN. They began to introduce the idea that Zionism is racism and fascism and all of these worst ills that humanity has produced already in the 60s. So there's, again, a very long history. The warfare against Israel in the UN is decades. It's half a century. It's more than half a century old at this point.
And let's have a look at our final prompt in our game of deja-vu. We were saying many American Jews don't speak Hebrew. Here we have the hilarious example, I think, showing they didn't really have any Jews at this protest. The large Seder plate of the Jewish Voice for Peace, the international Jewish arm of Hamas, essentially, at the University of Southern California, a Seder plate that says in the middle, "Stop Starving Gaza," and the items on the Seder plate, Safruk, Chesorach, Roram. And what we have here is, in fact, they've spelt the Hebrew words backwards. Roram is, in fact, Maror. Clear. I mean, they put out a statement afterwards saying, not all Jews speak Hebrew. It doesn't make us any less Jewish. Okay, if you can't spot that the Hebrew language is backwards, then perhaps we have some questions about that. And I'm wondering, we've spoken about Jews before who decided to take the side of anti-Semitic movements. What does this remind you of?
Well, remember that Hebrew was a prohibited language in the USSR. So one of the most...
but it's not in the United States, so no excuses here.
Absolutely no excuses. And in fact, when I first...
It's astonishing because it's not, I mean, they're not just thick. They're thick and self-righteous as well.
That's right. But they think that a good leftist, should reject Hebrew because it's the language of colonizers. You know, there is this whole...
Yes, don't say Shabbat Shalom. You say Gut Shabbos, like a good diasporist Jew.
That's exactly right. I mean, I find it really funny how...
Speak a language like Yiddish, untainted by Hebrew.
That's right.
Because Hebrew, of course, is a colonial language that comes from the Middle East. Awkward. I wonder where the Jews picked up this colonial language from. Where did it come from?
I know, exactly. Yeah, so it's really, it's funny, this idolizing of Yiddish and the pre-Holocaust,
Yiddish still written right to left, though. We have to
Well, that is very true. That is very true.
And with Hebrew letters.
Yes, that is very true. So yeah, long history to that. I don't see them giving this up anytime, especially given that it's JVP, which is just deeply involved in all of this. So we just have to, We just have to bring up a generation of Jews who see this picture and they immediately know that it's spelled wrong, because not a whole lot of American Jews probably even noticed.
And I'm sure that the viewers we have in the US who are watching the State of a Nation podcast absolutely committed to bringing up a generation of Jews who are literate, passionately committed to Jewish communities, and are going to be mounting a fight back against the horrific anti-Semitic movement we've seen sweep over elite institutions in the United States. You said throughout the conversation, no country has ever adopted anti-Zionism as an organizing principle of its politics and ever allowed Jewish life to flourish, even for those who thought they could find safety in the hands of the mob. Izabella Tabarovsky, thank you very much for joining me on State of a Nation.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be back soon with more in-depth conversations with experts to help us unpack the state of our nation. I'm Elon Levy, and thanks for watching.